Okay, I'm calling this special meeting, the board orientation, to order. Our first presentation is by Jeff Sylvan, Board Governance.
Recording in progress.
Now go. Sure.
I'm calling this special meeting, board orientation, to order. Our first presentation is by Jeff Sylvan, General Counsel on Board Governance.
Good morning. So we're actually covering a pretty wide group of topics, and I just put them under the general heading of board governance because that sort of fits all of it. So I do have sort of a summary PowerPoint. There are reference materials in the binders which you can look at as we go through it, or and take notes if that's helpful, or just save them for later as reference materials. And if there's other topics you would like more information on, we can plan a subsequent session. We can also get you more materials. You can build the binder as a reference tool during the orientation process. So I was going to cover a number of topics related to board governance. If at any time you have a question, stop me. The whole idea is to help you all get more familiar with kind of how things work. It's a lot of information today, so whatever we can do to make it easier to digest, please let us know. So one thing I thought I would just mention really quickly for whatever it's worth. I've represented boards in different capacities, both as the outside lawyer and a couple times now as being a lawyer on the regular staff of the organization. So I have that experience. The other thing is I've served on some boards and been through a lot of board training as part of that process, and then have gone through training to train boards, so I've done some of that. So some of the topics we're going to talk about are not, or ideas I'm going to share with you, are not specific to the Pima College Governing Board. They're just kind of generally accepted standards of board governance, and if you go to other programs, you likely will hear them, and they're really the same standards that apply whether it's a public body like this or to a nonprofit or even a for-profit corporation. So, and that's really the first topic we're going to talk about. Is fiduciary duty. So board members are generally considered fiduciaries. In some states, that's a matter of actual statutory law, but in all states, it's pretty much part of case law. So judges have decided, based on the legal traditions of our country, that board members are fiduciaries. Well, what does that mean? So a fiduciary is someone who acts on behalf of another without regard to their own interest. So you're making board members are charged to make decisions in the best interests of another. And in this case, one thing to think about, it's not just for others like the current people at Pima, students, employees, community members. It's really thinking about how to protect the institution so that it can provide the same services in the future. So not only thinking about the best interests of the institution and those it serves today, but those it's going to serve tomorrow. If you were to look at articles or cases about the elements of fiduciary duty, there are basically three elements, and I put an article in your materials from AGB, but it's about 15, 16 pages long, so I don't expect you to look at it today. The three main topics it covers are these, and these are really consistently kind of how the fiduciary duty is broken down. So there's the duty of loyalty, and that's to pursue the best interests of the college rather than personal or other considerations. In other words, you owe your allegiance to the good of the institution. And you'll see how these tie together. So for example, later we're going to talk about conflict of interest. Well, that is directly related to duty of loyalty, right? I can't consider my own personal gain or family member interests. I consider the institution. Duty of care. That's using reasonable due diligence, care, and skill to make decisions in the best interests of the college. In other words, it means trying to make sure you've done your homework before making a decision. It does not mean you have to be an expert in everything. That's not what's expected. So it's reasonable care. There is mindfulness to the fact that you're all essentially community members who have volunteered your time. So, and that's why you have full-time staff and we have outside consultants so that you can get the benefit of expertise, ask those critical questions, and then make an informed decision. As long as you're doing all of that, you will generally satisfy the duty of care. The duty of obedience is meaning that decisions that the board makes are supposed to be in furtherance of the college's mission. and that the board is acting and the institution are acting in compliance with whatever the applicable standards are, right? And an institution like Pima, we have a lot of those. There's federal law, there's state law, there's accreditation standards. There's a lot of standards that we're expected to follow. And as elected officials, there's also specific standards that apply to public offices. We'll talk about that a little bit more in detail later. So just a couple things I thought I would mention to kind of illustrate these ideas. So again, the overarching theme is, well, what's in the best interest of the organization? And so at Pima, of course, that means, well, think about, we have students, we have employees, we have community members, and community members also, of course, spans a lot of different interests, right? There's businesses, there's healthcare, there's people who are just passionate about a particular aspect. At Pima, they're all part of that community. And the real challenge for the board and really administration also is, how do you balance all of those to try and make sure you're making a decision that's in the best interest of all? And I guess one thing I'd share as something I've noticed is different groups will advocate a particular perspective to the board, and sometimes it's not always, what they're advocating may not always be in the best interest of the organization. It's in the interest of a particular group. And sometimes there is alignment, and sometimes they're not totally aligned. So a couple examples I thought I would mention about that. So for example, there was a faculty senate session where they were talking about workplace conditions and how important faculty workplace conditions are to the student experience. That is certainly true. If the faculty don't have good working conditions, it certainly can have a negative influence on student experience. And of course, we could say, well, what about the reverse, right? What goes for students presumably is also in the best interest of the organization. But why I mention that is, well, those two don't always exactly align, or not everything that seems to be in the best interests of a certain group of employees or students is actually in the best interest of the collective. So specifically, for example, so I started in Pima in 2013, and back then we didn't have consistent start times for classes. So that meant classes started at lots of different times during the morning, right? One class starts at 8, another one starts at 8:15. There was a lot of variation in classes, and that happened in large part because faculty and the administration related to that allowed a lot of autonomy about setting schedules. So people set schedules that worked for them. Well, you think about that from this, so that was great for the employees, not so good for students, because if you think about, if you're a student and I don't have consistent start times, it's hard to make sure I can build a schedule where I can actually get from one class to another when I need to. So something that seems like it was in the best interest of employees wasn't really in the best interest of students. Another example would be, so we have students, for example, many students who work part-time, have family commitments, et cetera, and maybe they can't get their, they have trouble making some of the support hours during the week, and they really spend most of the weekends doing their classwork. Well, from that perspective, having Pima faculty and tutors and support staff available all through the weekend when the students, it's convenient for the students, would be in the best interest of the students. That may be sort of true, but it doesn't necessarily align very well with the real life situation of most of our employees and faculty. So even though a particular idea might be advocated from a particular perspective, and the interest is important, like, well, how do we get students support at the times they need, or how do we set up schedules and other working conditions that are conducive to work-life balance for employees, particular positions are not necessarily in the best interest of everyone, and so those often end up in conflict, and then we have that issue of, well, okay, how do we balance all of that to make sure that we're coming up with this solution that will work for the broadest number of people possible. So that's kind of related to this concept of fiduciary duty. Another aspect I wanted to mention with respect to the duty of obedience that can be challenging at times is sometimes the rules that apply may not align with your personal views or what you think is right under the circumstances, and then there's a choice to be made. And so I'll give you an example of that. So that happens to lawyers. There's certain rules of conduct we're supposed to operate under, and sometimes they don't align with your personal values. So like that happened to me in a situation where I knew information about a client that for a variety of reasons seemed like it would be a good idea to reveal. But under the rules, I clearly could not do that. Even though it kind of seemed like the ethically correct thing to do was to reveal the information, I talked to someone who is in Arizona who is sort of a prominent authority on the ethics rules, and he said, well, that's easy. You can't say anything, right? Those rules, absolutely no. So I had a choice to make. Well, there's what I thought was ethically right, and there's what was the right rules under the profession. I chose the professional rules. So you may find yourself in that same situation where a rule of whether it's the bylaws or accreditation standard or some other rule may not seem to align with what you think is the right thing to do. But if you follow the standards expected of board members as fiduciaries, that's the choice. So just something to keep in mind. You may not happen to you, but you may find yourself in that situation. The last thing I wanted to mention is just sort of encapsulating this idea. I think about board members in this way, and maybe it's helpful for you. Really, ultimately, the board is the guardian of mission, right? So how do we make decisions at Pima that best further the mission of the college? And just from a staff perspective, let me share why that's really helpful. When you work at Pima every day, you get caught up in day-to-day things, and there's always the urgent thing that has to be dealt with at the moment. And that makes it hard for people, employees at Pima, to often stay totally focused on mission and that bigger picture, because there's always demands on you every day. It's really helpful having a board meeting once a month where the board can help us all be grounded again in, okay, let's focus on the mission and how do these decisions support the mission. So again, at least from the kind of the staff and I guess the student side, the board is in a really unique and important position to help on a regular basis, asking those questions about, well, how does this advance the mission? How will we know it's advancing the mission? That's really helpful. It's very easy, like I said, for those of us in the day-to-day to get involved. I'd also say that's part of why there's this division of responsibilities, that the board is responsible for the big picture, those high-level things, and staff is responsible for the day-to-day, because whenever there are problems or issues, it's kind of a natural tendency you want to solve them. But when you solve them, then it's easy to get involved in the day-to-day, in the weeds, as opposed to staying focused on big picture. Are we advancing the mission? And like I said, that's where the board plays that really critical role and helps all of us be reminded about that. Okay, any questions about any of that? Am I going too fast? Okay. Powers and duties of community colleges. So I'll explain what these are in a second, just by context. So these are not all of them, but these are the primary ones. So what this is linked to, and I printed these materials, they're in your notebooks, these are the two main statutes that lay out the powers and authorities of community college governing boards. So just a little context, and we can walk through them a little bit. So ARS stands for Arizona Revised Statutes. That's what we call the body of laws passed by our legislature. Title 15 is the section of the ARS that has all the education-related codes, and the 1400 series is pretty much community colleges. So there is kind of a structure to the numbering system. So just when you see a citation ARS with some number dash another number, that's what it is. The first number is the section or title, and then the larger number series afterwards is the specific section of the statutory code. So in the statutes related to community colleges, 15-14, 44, and 45 are the two main laws that lay out the specific responsibilities and authorities of community college governing boards. They both of them have some that are mandatory. Boards shall do certain things. That's mandatory language. It's a requirement. They also have sections that talk about what boards may do. So it's an authority the board has. It may or may not choose to exercise that authority. So they're in your materials. So if you want to follow along, or I could figure out how to open the link if that's easier and put them up on the screen. You have a preference?
We can follow.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
I can follow in here.
So if you flip, there's a tab behind a blue page that says Powers and Duties of Community College Boards. Oh, sorry, I guess mine has color tabs and yours don't. Sorry about that. So it's under the tab that says Powers and Duties of Community College Governing Boards. Okay. So the first one is 15-1444, General Powers and Duties of District Boards. And so you'll see there's a whole list. So the first list are things that boards have to do. So the first one, you have to maintain a community college for at least 8 months per year. Of course, what's interesting is it doesn't actually tell you what that means, right? What does it mean to maintain a community college for 8 months per year? It's not really defined anywhere. Generally accepted, like we do, is we have 2 academic semesters. We offer classes for at least 8 months a year. Presumably that satisfies that requirement. Adopt policies in a public forum to offer programs meeting the educational needs of the population we serve. Again, obviously, key function of the board, you set policy at the college. Again, it doesn't tell you anything about what specific policies the board has to adopt, just that it is the responsibility of the board to establish that policy framework. Enforce the course of study. So one of the things you'll see from time to time, the administration will come to the board with, this is a program that the college would like to offer, and this is the degree or certificate or whatever credential is associated with it that will be presented to the board. You will approve them or not, depending on whether you're satisfied it's appropriate. That falls directly into that third category. Visit each community college under its jurisdiction and examine the management conditions and needs. So that's a little bit interesting because Pima College is a college. This sounds like it's referring to multiple colleges. There's at least one district in Arizona where they're technically considered to have multiple colleges. That's Maricopa, because each of their colleges is separately accredited. So from a education and regulatory standpoint, Rio Salado and South Mountain, et cetera, those are separate educational entities. At Pima, we have one regional accreditation. So I just mentioned that so you sort of understand why that language is there. So there are some districts that have multiple college. Pima, we only have one. We are one. Multiple campuses, but one considered one college. And again, it's interesting. It doesn't really, you won't find anything that really tells you specifically what it means to do those things. Those at Pima at least are accomplished clearly through board meetings where the board asks for information about specific topics, sets the goals, looks at metrics on how the college is making progress on those goals. All of those would certainly fit within the parameters of this requirement. Exclude from community colleges certain publications that are of a sectarian, partisan, or denominational character used as textbooks. So what's interesting about that is, of course, we do have partisan, religious, et cetera, other materials that are part of course materials, but they're not the textbook for any particular course.
Do we have to approve textbook adoption?
No. We could certainly provide information about it. It's not required. And so this is also, there's an interesting tension here between some regulatory requirements and a longstanding principle of academic freedom. Faculty have a lot of autonomy as a group to pick their materials. They meet, departments meet to discuss what materials to use. They're generally not specifically approved by the board. So we could certainly provide information. If you think about that, that'd be quite a gargantuan task. To actually have to approve every specific publication that the college uses.
So systemically then we're not doing this.
You're not doing what? Excluding the materials? So another thing to think about is a lot of functions at Pima, the board sets policies, right? So we have criteria about what materials get used, and then administration, and in this case, working with faculty, figure out how to implement that and have more detailed requirements. So one thing the board could do to have greater assurance of that is we could provide information so you see what the criteria are and how materials are selected and make sure that that meets with what the board thinks is appropriate. Right. But I said it's not realistic for the board to approve every single material used in every classroom.
Jeff, a question about, this is just theoretical, but so if someone, let's say a student or somebody had an issue with one of the textbooks that was being used for whatever reason, they thought it was bad does that theoretically come to the board, or does it go through that process you're just talking about?
So that would generally go through some sort of request or complaint process at the college that would be handled initially by faculty and then potentially by a department chair, dean, et cetera. So the board is required to basically employ appropriate personnel to run the institution. Certain employees can have multi-year contracts, but there's only a limited group that can. Generally, employees at Pima, if they have an employment contract, it's 1 year. The board sets the salaries for the college, and you'll see, of course, the board voted on the class and comp system. The board, as part of the budgeting process, will approve the overall salary budget, and then obviously there's a system in place to administer that. The board has the authority to remove employees if it thinks that's the appropriate thing to do. The board has the authority and responsibility to award degrees, certificates, diplomas, et cetera. So it's interesting, this is in the shall section, but it's actually discretionary. The college may have a police force. Obviously, we currently do. The board has the authority to purchase, sell, and lease real property. There's also some insurance obligations. Those will get shared with the board every year, part of the both the budget and the contract approval process. You'll see different types of insurance agreements brought to the board for approval. Then there are a variety of discretionary powers the board has. Most of those, so some of those, as you'll see, relate to the receipt of gifts that are given to the college and managed for the benefit of the college. As I mentioned before, leasing real property. So we have the authority, the board has the authority to both lease property, meaning we could be the tenant or we could be the landlord, and we do both of those. The college, through the board, has the authority to sue and be sued. There are certain immunities for board members, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. There's also some level of immunities for the college, depending on what actions type governmental function we're talking about. The board has the authority to enter contracts. Some of that authority has been delegated to the chancellor. Some of that is reserved to the board. That's reflected in one of the board policies that talks about different types of contracts and dollar amounts. And that has changed over time. The board has the authority to build things and repair the property under the ownership of the college. The board can enter agreements essentially with other districts to set standards and jointly purchase goods and services. We do that in many areas. It's just more efficient. We get better purchasing power. There's a lot of reasons why it's just more efficient to do it that way. Employee benefit plans is another discretionary power, so we don't have to offer benefit plans. Obviously, there's very compelling reasons to do so, and we have a variety of benefits that are approved by the board. There's some general authority about accepting gifts. This is another one of those. So we can accept gifts, grants, et cetera. And there are board policies about each of those topics with sort of specific procedures for each of those. So I wasn't going to go into those today, but just so you know, there are specific procedures for grants and accepting gifts. We have the authority to enter agreements with other public entities around Arizona, and we do that for a whole variety of purposes. Those are a category of agreements that has been specifically reserved to the board, so all of those will come to the board for a vote. The board has naming authority, so and there is a policy about that and a process for that. So the college at different times has named things, buildings, programs, service centers, et cetera, for either because someone has made a really substantial gift to the college or to honor someone who has really shown extensive commitment to the college. Again, those will come to the board. That's a board reserved authority. A few years ago, the legislature amended this statute. One of the amendments they made was allowing the colleges to engage in really kind of research and development, sort of innovative activities, and we have the authority to enter agreements with other entities in order to do that. Intergovernmental agreements on reciprocity, what that means is reciprocity with other states and their educational systems. So we have agreements, for example, with the Department of Education in New Mexico, and we have an agreement where students from New Mexico can come to Pima and pay the in-state New Mexico tuition, and we have Pima students who can go to New Mexico universities and colleges and pay the in-state Arizona tuition. So we have the authority to do that, and we don't have a lot of those agreements, but we do have a few of those. Pima is expressly allowed to engage in entrepreneurial and commercial activities. There's a limited number of those, but just so you know, it is within the authority of the college. And in this section and in the following, you'll see about how that money is exempt from certain constitutional provisions. That's expenditure limit. So if we do entrepreneurial activities and make money at it, that does not count toward those revenues do not count toward expenditure limit. Expenditure limit, the easy way to remember is expenditure limit really applies to tax-based revenues. That's a little bit oversimplified, but for general purposes, if you think of it that way, that will be correct most of the time. We can also collect fees for what are called auxiliary functions, so bookstore, cafeteria, those kind of things, which then implicitly means we're allowed to offer those services and take the steps necessary in order to carry out those services. We can contract with other state entities and tribal governments in order to generally, it says provide goods and services, really it's what we do, of course, is educational services. And the revenues from that are not part of expenditure limit. Part of the reason for that is if you think about it, other governmental entities, their expenditures are capped by expenditure limit, so it's already subject to expenditure limit as opposed to being counted twice. We have the authority now to offer baccalaureate degrees. You'll be hearing more of that as the college explores that possibility. Trying to think of what's other. Most of these others don't apply to us. Obviously, if we acquire property, and we do, and there's a delinquent tax bill, we pay it. That says it in the statute. Of course we do that. Vehicle emission control area is not really an issue for us. If it were, this is what would apply. We can and do enter agreements, of course, with some of the technical education districts, JTED, et cetera, and others, and there's more statutory language about that, but this essentially gives the board the authority to do that. Interestingly, there's a specific provision allowing Pima to enter an exchange program with educational institutions in Sonora, Mexico, and we do have agreements about that. And then, of course, we have certain responsibilities to facilitate transfer. All right, so that's one list. So the second list of, I guess I'll call these primary responsibilities and duties. So these are really the duties that tie directly to the educational mission of the college. So in this is in 1445, these are all listed as shall, so they're mandatory obligations of the college and therefore activities that the governing board is responsible to make sure that we're carrying out in some way. So again, you'll see the first one is adopt policies. So the general operating parameters of the college are set by the governing board. The governing board is also responsible working with others to make sure that we have standards in place for accreditation of community colleges. I guess I'll just mention as an aside, one of the things that's a little bit, that changed over time is in the past, there was a state board for community colleges, which in conjunction with the local boards carried out a lot of these functions. Well, that went away. The legislature abolished that board, and so now all of those duties were transferred onto the individual community college boards, and we have organizations like there's the Arizona Association of Community College Trustees that provides, I may have got not all of the names in that list, but that our board has a representative and an alternate to, because that's one of the groups that helps coordinate some of the functions that you'll see in these requirements.
Excuse me, Jeff, was the group that was abolished, was that the Arizona Board of Regents, or is that still, was it a different group?
So different group. The Arizona Board of Regents is the group that's primarily responsible for administering the state university system. There was a completely separate state board for community colleges. I don't remember when that was abolished. Sometime in the early 2000s, if I remember correctly. So one of the things that happened is most of the property of community colleges was actually owned by the state board, and when it was abolished, all the ownership was transferred to the local districts.
Isn't that when the certification requirements for community college faculty went away?
I don't know. That's a good question. And then, of course, the main certification requirement, if you will, is that our accreditor has certain requirements in order for us to allow faculty to teach 4-credit classes and other classes. And so the standards right now are pretty much driven by our accreditor, and in some cases by specialty accreditors, right? So for nursing, the State Board of Nursing sets requirements for faculty. For our aviation program, it's the Federal Aviation Administration. So it's mostly the regulators that are setting faculty credentialing requirements. Setting the tuition is the responsibility of the governing board. That's going to be appearing on your agenda fairly quickly. I expect probably at the study session this afternoon, David B. will probably speak somewhat about that. The governing board does have the authority to waive tuition in certain circumstances, and so, for example, it has done so. Employees at Pima can take classes. We pay the registration fee, but employees don't pay for tuition or their dependents. There's certain reporting requirements for data that you'll see we have to do. That's what STAR, our in-house institutional research office, basically handles the reporting of all official reports that are due to the state. Again, establishing curriculum. There's some overlap between some of these requirements and some of the ones you heard. So establishing the curriculum is a board responsibility. Again, if the college changes major components of classes, degrees, certificates, et cetera, that will come to the board for approval before it happens. And then also, depending on how substantial the changes, some of those also require creditor approval. Open it, sort of, the board is also responsible to determine sort of the entry requirements for different classes. Most classes at Pima, of course, are open enrollment. That's not true for some specialty areas, right? Nursing, for example, there's some programs that have prerequisite or other credential requirements before you can be admitted. Again, any program that has those, that would be part of the approval process when it comes to the board. Requirements about establishing vocational, technical educational programs. That follows a process similar to what I just mentioned. Those will all come to the board for approval. We already talked about qualifications for instructional staff. Requirements related to or the ability to transfer. Again, these are all, so most of these things are not things that happen on an annual basis. Most of these are already well established. They were established at some point in the past. What would come to this board is if the college decides to make significant changes, those will come to the board for approval so that we're complying both with these requirements and with accreditor requirements. So there's also some requirements here for coordination with the State Board of Education. The State Board of Education primarily is involved in K-12 education, but there's some areas because, of course, there's a significant amount of transition from people going from K-12 into higher ed. So there are some coordination functions mostly related to data exchange, preparing reports, jointly doing strategic plans, those sort of things. That's kind of what's covered by those next few entries in this statute. And again, most of those, they'll get reported to the board, but obviously the legwork for that gets carried out by different offices around the college. There are some specific requirements about entry for veterans, and of course, as you may have heard, or you'll certainly have an opportunity to learn more about, we have many programs targeted toward assisting veterans to further their education. There are certain requirements about the college requiring publishers to provide software and some other accessibility to their textbooks. Again, so that's a college requirement. It's not something the board actively does, but Pima in its procurement and academic materials requirements follows those standards. And if you want more information about that, we could certainly have the staff that are primarily involved in those come in and talk about it some more. Subsection 15 is about dual enrollment. So again, you'll see all those dual enrollment agreements come to the board. You get quite a few of them in a typical year. And then the last requirement, which is sort of interesting, is that all of our classrooms have to have a flag of a certain size and a printing of the Constitution, state requirement, I guess, to support civics and patriotism. And if you walk around all the classrooms at Pima, hopefully you will in fact see that there is a printed version of the Constitution and a flag. Okay, so I just went through that really fast, but it maybe gives you at least a little idea of sort of the range of activities that the college undertakes, and kind of there's some more specific ones of those where there is a regular recurring board role. And then, like I said, some of them only come up when there's a significant change at the college. So sorry, I said that's a lot. Any particular questions about any of those?
I have a quick question back on in 1444, number 4, visit each community college under its jurisdiction. So as I've been reading all of these Arizona revised statutes, how one interprets them is definitely significant. And so how I interpreted that is, to visit the campuses. So I agree we may have different opinions about what it means, but will we ever get in trouble for interpreting it our way?
So, well, the answer is potentially yes. So the question is, they're not, so as you noted, there's not a lot of definition in here, and you won't find any, especially because there's no state board anymore that might issue clarifying language or guidance. So, right, what does it mean to visit each community college, or in our case, campus? It doesn't say specifically what that means. So could you get in trouble for doing that? Potentially, and the reason I say that is because, so as I mentioned, Pima follows lots of rules, federal rules, state rules, accreditor rules. So if a statute gets interpreted in a way that's contrary to what one of those other rules is, the state isn't going to have a problem with whatever happened, but that other entity might, federal government, accreditor. And fortunately, I mean, there is a way to interpret these where you can harmonize all of them, right? So for example, visiting, there's a guideline about, we'll let the chancellor's office know, and usually we give people a heads up and can arrange visits. Or there also will be organized visits to different campuses to look at different programs. And of course, if the board had an interest in a particular program and requested it, we could certainly arrange some kind of visit. So sometimes it's not the what, it's the how that something gets done. And usually there's a way to harmonize all of these, but I guess it's just worth noting, it is possible sometimes to be in compliance with state statute, but not be in compliance with what an accreditor or Department of Education thinks is appropriate.
You just mentioned to visit a college, inform the chancellor. Is that a written rule?
So in the bylaws, we have a provision about that. And again, it's really, there's multiple reasons for it. It helps the chancellor know what board members are doing and what they might be interested in. It also allows us to track all of that. So one of the pieces of evidence, for example, that we're compiling for the HLSC accreditation, reaccreditation process is we want to be able to track the college-related activities that board members engage in, because that allows us to provide evidence to HLC to show that the board is looking into what's going on at the college, that the board is engaged with community organizations or endeavors, et cetera. So that's another reason, is so that we can actually make sure we're compiling appropriate evidence that we're going to need to show our accreditor.
First page, item number 8. Help me understand. We're responsible for removing people that require removal, but we don't hire them? And do we enter into discipline with employees?
So this provision is about removing an officer or employee if it's if in its judgment, the interests of education in the state require removal, right? So if the board thought someone at Pima was doing something so serious that that person ought to be removed, the board has the authority to do that. So the one obvious person that the board has immediate authority over would be hiring or removing, replacing a chancellor. I think your question is really geared toward, well, what about everybody else? So the board has delegated responsibility for sort of day-to-day personnel management to the chancellor, and there is a process which includes discipline and review of disciplinary decisions so that we're following a due process, fair process, making sure that decisions are well thought out before and well substantiated before some kind of discipline is imposed. So the board has the authority to do it, and if something, so the board has the authority, that's one of the authorities that's been primarily delegated to the chancellor, who of course doesn't handle these on a day-to-day basis. That's why we have an HR department and supervisors who work together on those.
I guess part of what I'm asking is, will we find ourselves in a position where we're looking at an appeal of a termination or an appeal of a suspension of an employee?
So the current system does not have appeals go all the way to the governing board.
So to attach a question to that, it looks like number 6 says the board employs everybody's listed on that, right? Instructors, lecturers, other officers and employees it deems necessary. So number 6 says we hire, the board shall do this, we hire everybody. And then number 8, we also remove. So is it true that the law says it's our duty, but in the past, different governing boards have delegated that authority to the chancellor?
So, right, so boards have delegated, and then what happens is there's reporting to the board about hiring decisions and other personnel-related decisions, so the board has the opportunity to be aware of what's going on and, of course, ask follow-up questions, but the actual specific decisions were delegated. So in the past, the board voted to approve all new hires. There were some challenges to that from a practical standpoint from a couple of perspectives. So one, of course, is the board was not involved in the hiring and interview process, so the board doesn't actually, they don't know what the candidate pool was like, they weren't involved in the process to see that. The other challenge so one was there was, and it's probably not something governing boards want or should do, right? You're not going to participate in every hiring process. So one, there was a reality about how much knowledge the board might have about any particular decision. The second challenge that the way this was done in the past was that the board had to vote and approve all new hires. That's a challenge for 2 reasons. One is it caused a big delay in the hiring, right? Well, I can't actually offer you the job because the board has to vote on it, and so that depends on the board schedule. The other challenge for some people was then their name is in a public, it's published on a list that's open to the public, and their employer may not yet know that they're leaving, and it puts the individual in an awkward position because technically they don't actually have the new job until the board votes, but their name is already out there. So it caused some challenges. So for a couple of for those reasons, and just kind of the practicality of it, a number of years ago, the board delegated, again, the day-to-day decision to the chancellor, which really means the human resources department and the relevant supervisors, but has some reporting requirements so that the board has an idea of what's going on. And of course, if the board would like additional information about details of the process, we can certainly make that available.
Okay, we're going to call a recess for about 5 minutes. Thank you. order.
All right, thank you. So next topic, rules of conduct, and we've already covered these, so I wasn't really planning to cover them in depth at this point. Open meetings law, public records, conflict of interest, and some other ethical rules that flow out of state statute. Those were captured in those draft forms I sent around. So if you have specific questions about those, happy to talk about it. Or if you have a lot of questions, maybe we set a different time, because I would like to get those finalized at some point, whichever way you prefer.
What specifically do you want us to sign?
So kind of pursuant to the bylaws, the accreditation plan, and just sort of some good practice, there was 2 documents that we generated. So one was an acknowledgement that executive session content was confidential, and the second one is some ethical standards and a conflict of interest disclosure statement. So what it does is it talks about, it kind of runs through basic standards that apply to public officials. For example, you can't use your official position to get a personal benefit or a benefit for a relative. You cannot ask for gifts or compensation from a vendor or a potential vendor. So it's things like that that are intended to preserve sort of the integrity and the independence of the board. And so there's one form that kind of says, here's what those are, and you understand you're supposed to follow them, and if you have a question, here's what you do. And then the other part is, if at some point you do think, well, maybe I have a conflict of interest, and it has happened for board members before. We were looking at purchasing some properties, and it turned out that a board member had a partnership interest in a real estate partnership that owned one of them, and so she disclosed that, no problem. We documented that, and then she just recused herself from the conversation about that. So one of the forms is just here's what explains what a conflict of interest is, and says, if you think you ever have one, here's what you do to disclose it, and then we figure out what to do to make sure, determine, is it or isn't it? If it is, here's the appropriate step, and then we keep that documentation so that we can verify that board members are being mindful about conflict of interest and that we've addressed it. So that's the second form, and so again, it's helpful as evidence to show, yep, board members did take the time to review it, ask questions, agree that that's what they're going to follow, and then it, like I said, tells you what to do if you have a question or concern. So maybe what we ought to do is, if following today you could take another look at that. If you have questions or concerns, let me know. If not, then let's figure out how we're going to finalize it, and maybe we could talk about how to do that in conjunction with one of the upcoming meetings.
Jeff, I don't remember if I signed them or not, but if you want to give me the things, I mean, you can give them to me today. If you have them, I'll sign it and give it to you.
Andrea certainly has extra copies. One other one I'll just mention, because it might not be what you expect, and that's endorse a commercial service or product. And what we mean by that is, as Pima College, we don't say this vendor is the best ever or this particular product is the best ever. And that's because as a public entity, we're trying to do is promote fair competition and not put our finger on the scale. So if someone wanted to know how we were satisfied with the vendor, we would answer that question, but we don't go around promoting individual goods, particular goods or services, and the same would apply to employees and public officials. Okay. Liability issues, one of those fun questions that lawyers get to talk to with their clients and client representatives. So we went through this whole list of obligations that the college and for some aspects the board in particular has responsibilities for, and then some of the ethical things we just talked about, conflict of interest, for example. Those are responsibilities, standards that the board has to meet, and for some of them there are consequences for violation. So there's actually a criminal statute. Misfeasance is knowingly failing to perform a duty you have. So for example, by state law, Pima College must pass a budget by a certain date. And there's certain requirements about that. If the board didn't follow them, that arguably is misfeasance, right? Or let's say the chancellor leaves and the board says, we don't need a chancellor, we'll just manage the college, we don't need to hire a chancellor. Well, there's a statute that says you're supposed to hire a chancellor in certain things. Maybe it's a violation of that. So Anyway, the idea is if there's a duty you know, and you just refuse to do it or fail to do it, arguably it's a misdemeanor. Another statute to be mindful about is using college influences to influence the outcome of an election. So that applies to staff as well as to board members. So the idea is that, again, political entities, we're supposed to be neutral in an election. We don't take a side. That's true for a ballot initiative. It's true for a bond measure. It would be true for an election of any of the board offices. So just be mindful of that. And this is another one where sending an email is a really easy way to violate the law without realizing it, right? Because if you used your Pima College email account to send out emails to people, hey, there's a fundraiser for candidate X, you should really go, you just probably violated that statute. And influence means basically signal to someone how they should vote in a particular election. It's not likely to come up with respect to a ballot initiative or a bond because we don't have any of those planned. We have done them in the past, and then we did a much more in-depth training about during one of those elections, here's what you can do, here's what you can't do. The most likely way this will come up again would be in 2024 when we have board seats up for election. We'll certainly talk about it in a lot more detail when campaign season kicks off. So, but in the meantime, it's probably not likely to come up, but just be mindful of it.
Jeff, just to clarify, sorry, I know we'll go into depth later, but this is about using, so can you define, maybe the easiest question is, can you define resources in there for me?
Sure, so college resources would be in your position as a board member using a college room, using our website for something, using our email. So resources is really any, I don't want to use a definition by making, right, a resource is a resource. Is some tool or capacity that the college has. And part of why this is, we'll talk about it when there's a pending election more for board members, is as a candidate or as a private citizen, you have First Amendment rights. You can participate in political activities. You just can't do it in your capacity as a board member. So I'll give you another example. Let's say we're having a board meeting and there's some election going on, county election, state, some other federal, whatever, some other election. If you used, for example, board comments to opine about the election and really people should do this, that's a problem because we are using a college resource, right? It's college time devoted to college business. It's streamed through our web service. It's posted on the college website. That's using college resources.
Okay, so I'm not a resource, right? I'm just, so like, for example, using your fundraiser example from a second ago, if I like participated in a fundraiser, not, I mean, obviously there's no elections going on right now, but I participated in a fundraiser, someone introduced me or identified me as a member of the board, I said you should vote for this person, that's not.
Correct.
Okay.
Right, you might just want to say I'm not, I mean, if you wanted to be really careful, you'd say I'm not here speaking on behalf of Pima, I'm here speaking on on behalf of myself, and I endorse so-and-so. Well, that's okay. You're, as an individual, you have the right to participate in the political process. That's why I said when an election comes up, we can talk about this in a lot more depth, but I don't expect that to happen, at least probably for about a year.
Okay, so along that same 15-1408, it says using facilities is also to influence the outcome of election would not be okay. So when I was a candidate, a non-board member, I was photographed in front of Pima's logos and Pima's buildings. I walked through Pima's buildings. I did all sorts of YouTube little, whatever those YouTube shows are called. But as a board member, would I be allowed to do those same things in 6 years when I decide to run again?
So here would be the distinction. So our campuses are open. Any member of the public could come here and take a photograph outside of a building, right? So if you came and someone on your campaign staff or a friend took the picture, that's not a problem. What you wouldn't do is have our PCC TV crew or others take the photographs for you, because now you are using college resources. So does that help? I said you could, candidates or people could use college facilities the same as anyone else. What you can't do is sort of use your position at Pima or actually have Pima employees related to their regular work now do something that's going to be connected to a political campaign. Yeah, no, it's a good question. I said that's why when we get closer to an election, we should talk about it in greater depth. So, because there's lots of things you can do, there's some you can't, better not to cause a problem. And this actually is a good example of, because of something that happened at a community college that legislators were really unhappy about, this law got passed. On a happier note, immunity. So when board members are acting in good faith and having conversation and making decisions at a board meeting, you have absolute immunity from that. So when the board is basically carrying out its responsibilities and exercising its discretion and making decisions for the college in the formal process where that's supposed to happen, you have immunity from any claims arising from that, right? So if someone's unhappy, I don't like what you decided about tuition or property tax or about approving this course or not approving this course, you cannot be sued individually for that. There's also liability coverage available for board members. So Pima has a really comprehensive liability coverage agreement that, so again, as long as board members are acting in the course and scope of their duties, there's both defense and indemnity. So defense is the college, through its liability carrier, would provide legal representation. Indemnity is if there were a judgment or a claim, if there were actually damages awarded, then that would get paid through a combination of the liability coverage and the college. So it doesn't mean that board members don't get sued and named individually, but through as long as they're acting within the boundaries of their responsibilities and what they were doing was actually something related to college business, there is coverage in place.
Jeff, so if we get served, what do we do?
Tell me right away. Most of the time what happens is people will actually contact, because general counsel's office or legal department is listed on the website, usually they'll contact us first to talk about that. But if you got served, you should notify us right away so that we can put the carrier on notice and get legal counsel arranged immediately so that there's no delay. I was just going to mention a few things. Relationship with the chancellor, so specific responsibilities. This flows both from kind of general principles of what boards do, as well as some of those statutory provisions we looked at before. So the board's responsible for hiring the chancellor, delegating authority to the chancellor, which is done in a variety of ways, through the employment contract, through the bylaws, through board policies, through the goals that are set for the chancellor. Supervise the chancellor, so regular evaluation. There's a formal annual evaluation, and then on an ongoing basis, the board provides feedback. Goal setting, which I mentioned before, and then if and when appropriate, replace the chancellor is also a responsibility of the board. Any questions about any of those? Okay, role of legal counsel. We've discussed this a little bit, so I'll not spend too much time on it. So the role of legal counsel at Pima is defined really by two sets of rules. One is the Arizona Rules of Professional Conduct. Those are rules set by the state Supreme Court and the Arizona State Bar, and Board Policy 6.01. So there is a board policy that specifically discusses the role of counsel and the relationship. So when I got to Pima, I was the first in-house legal counsel, so that's one of the first things I did is say, well, we ought to have a board policy about this. This language tracks what was used at Maricopa and other community colleges. It's a pretty close model. Part of this was to clarify that the college is the client. Obviously, Pima is not a person, so it can't do things. It does things through people. The client then are the authorized decision makers, so starting with the board, chancellor, and whoever has been delegated a specific responsibility. The client or the authorized representatives decide what the objectives are. The job of the lawyer is to provide advice and then implement the decision. So that's really simply what the role is. And so one consequence of that is, my job is to help whether it's the board or an administrator or a staff member, understand what rules might apply and kind of help them think about, well, here's what your options are, and here might be the trade-offs of those options, and then ultimately they make the decision. So I guess I just say that because if it ever sounds like I'm telling someone what to do, that's not what I'm doing. It's not meant that way. A benefit and a hazard of being a lawyer is you just give advice, clients make decisions, and then you carry them out. I said that, I know that's really quick, but I'm trying to cover everything within our time, and we can certainly cover any of these in depth later. And if you want at some point take the time and read that board policy, then I'm also happy to answer any questions.
This isn't exactly along what you're talking about, but if one of us or the entire board wants to, look at changing a board policy, when will we be told, or is that just something that we're supposed to know how to do that?
So if a board member wants to, so if you look at the board policies, there are dates when they're supposed to be reviewed and updated. But really, at any time, if any board member thinks, well, we should really look at this issue, then just let the chancellor's office know, and we will kind of talk about how the process works. Typically, so sometimes board members have initiated requests, I think we should look at this issue, and then typically what we'll do is probably have a study session so we can talk about it more in depth and have people from areas impacted provide information. Typically what those people would do depending on what the direction is from the board, might provide some ideas. Well, you could change, if that's what you're trying to do, then you could change this or change that. Board policies as a whole are all assigned to different administrative units, and in the next session I do with you, I'm going to have my colleague Seth here as well he's going to talk more in depth about that, but essentially different units of the college are responsible for periodically updating board policies, and then they'll come to the board with, here's what we're thinking, what's your perspective, is there any particular things we should be mindful of, and then provide recommendations. And then there's always a board, it's always a two-step process with the board. There'll be a reading kind of discussion meeting to just talk about it, and then there'll be a later vote, and it could be more than that depending on how many changes or ideas there are. But there'll always be separate meetings of, let's talk about it, look at possible recommendations, get direction from the board, versus the meeting where the vote actually happens.
So specifically, what are the requirements if there's an amendment or a change in a policy? Public readings, number of public readings, what's our responsibility?
So the minimum requirement is one public reading, and then at the next meeting it could be voted on. At Pima, the other thing we always do is we don't change board policies unless we do a couple other things. One is it goes to all the governance groups, faculty, senate, staff council, et cetera, for them to have an opportunity to look at it and comment, and we post it for 21 days so anyone at Pima or the community could make comments. We collect all of those comments, we provide it to the board and the unit that's kind of the lead on that policy to consider it and figure out whether they're making good suggestions or there's other things we should take into account. So all of that will happen before the vote meeting. So it takes if the real question is how long does it take, it's usually a few months if we're going to do the thing from, if we follow the normal process and make sure we're circulating it and giving everyone an opportunity to comment, it's at least 2 months.
If it's if it affects personnel, does that take longer?
No, it would be similar. The only exception would be, let's say there was a change of law or some emergency thing happened, then clearly the board could change the policy. We would probably still go back and do a review process to see if adjustments were made, but you could adopt an interim policy quickly if you had to. But typically, whether it's personnel related or college operations, the regular process, and this is actually so below board policies, there's administrative procedures. Well, the administrative procedures for board policies and administrative procedures talk about going through, circulating to the governance groups for their review, 21-day. Now, sometimes it happens concurrently. So it goes to the governance groups and then immediately we'll post for 21-day comment. So it's not one after the other. They're running concurrently, but at least 2 to 3 months. Okay, board procedures, some of these I think you're already familiar with. Agenda development, so the chair working with the chancellor will collect any input from board members about how to develop the agenda. Parliamentary procedure, I put in your, it should be in your notebooks, sort of an annotated script, if you will, that just walks through each sections of the meeting with just, and it's not a script in the sense of like you have to read this, it's just sort of here's an example of what you could say and kind of how it works with some examples. So that may also be another a good thing for you to just take some time and take a look at it, and then if you have follow-up questions or you think that maybe there's a way we should change some of that, then let's have that conversation. Where did this come from? So we don't follow Robert's rules exactly. Robert's rules is like an encyclopedia. It's really cumbersome, and it's not intended for small bodies. It's intended for legislators with 100+ people. So we follow a simplified version of Robert's rules that's pretty consistent among most small boards, which is where what you're seeing comes from. For example, in Robert's rules, there's no such thing as a friendly amendment. But in our board meetings, it makes a lot of sense, and it's a practice used by most of the smaller local governing bodies. So what you see in there is basically Robert's rules, but modified for smaller organizations. All right, last one on this, responding to complaints. So there is a process in the bylaws for about reporting complaints, concerns. Generally, depending on what it is, you go to the board chair, the chancellor, or me, or all of us, or any combination of that, and depending on what it is, then we will work with the board to figure out what the appropriate remedy is. The one, I guess, a caution I'll raise, part of the reason we have this process is so board members are not investigating complaints themselves. There's a lot of reasons not to do that. And the other thing I would just share is you will, of course, get a lot of complaints, especially because you're new, right? When Lee joined Pima, lots of people came to him with complaints. Every time there's been new board members, people go to them with complaints. And one of the reasons we have a process and we want to make sure we do a thorough review is sometimes people have a sincere belief, but they're mistaken. And so we want to do a thorough investigation to make sure that what they're saying is true. And I'll share, I kind of have learned that lesson myself the hard way. I had one time where someone came into my office, shared a concern, and I thought, wow, that is concerning. I can see why you're concerned about that. So I went storming down the hallway into a manager's office and had a conversation. And of course, what I found out was the person didn't know a lot of things about what had happened. And so based on their little piece of information, they had a serious concern, which made sense. But when you knew the full picture, it was really different. The other experience I had was in an employment case. An employee came forward, a female employee complained about sexual harassment, and she had a couple emails to verify her story. Well, when you heard what she said and you looked to the emails, it was very concerning, and it seemed like there was a serious problem. Well, when we did the thorough investigation, interviewed some people, and looked at all of the emails, it turned out it was the other way around. She was actually the aggressor, and the male had tried to break it off, and she was upset with him. So what I thought was one thing turned out to be radically different, which is why we just want to be careful that we follow an appropriate process so we do the best possible to really get a full understanding of what the situation is and what happened. And there's people at Pima who are trained in how to do that, and in appropriate situations we also bring in outside people to do it, so that way we have people who are really expert in doing it and we can rely on their experience and skills.
So real quick question, I was looking at that last Article 12 about the complaints, and on number 2B, 2A on the very, very end, it says the recipient of the complaint, including an individual board member, shall notify the board chair and college general counsel of the complaint, who shall notify all board members as soon as possible. Is that referring to the board chair or to the general counsel, or both of them doing the notifying all the board members as soon as possible?
So they don't both have to do the notifying, but in the past what has happened is if there's a serious complaint, if it came to me, then I'll notify the board chair. If it comes to the board chair, they notify me, and then we figure out who should send a notice. So we don't send duplicate notices, I think is what you're asking about. We don't both there's usually a consultation, and then we figure out, okay, who's going to send the notice and what should it say. Okay, and then
Going back to board procedures, the adjournment, seems like we have two options. One is the chair asks if there's any more business. If none, you adjourn, or there's a motion to adjourn. What's the chair's preference?
I'd say to save time, right, that 4.5 seconds, if there's no more business, I'll just adjourn, if that's all right with everybody else.
Fine.
so that's a good example of, if we followed Robert's rules strictly, you can't do that, but it doesn't make sense in a small board like ours where the chair can just ask, right, does anyone have anything else? No, great, we're adjourned. It works perfectly well. The last thing I just wanted to mention was Andrea sent out some materials just about kind of how travel process and charges work. So I just want to make sure everyone got that. If you had questions, we'll figure out how to do some follow-up. This afternoon at the study session, we're going to show you kind of what the calendar of some of the major outside of Pima training opportunities are, so that you could all think about what events you want to go to, how do you want to prioritize, et cetera. So that'll be this afternoon, but for now, I just want to take a moment to make sure you all got the materials from Andrea, and if you have questions about how travel gets arranged or how things get paid for, let us know, and we will make sure to get those addressed.
I might have either overlooked it or not paid attention. I did get something recently about the SAP Concor, something like that, and I clicked on that link and I tried to see what it was about, but I didn't have the appropriate password, so I didn't do something correct.
Okay, so just so others can hear, apparently there's a couple other steps we need to take, so we'll get those materials to you, and then it sounds like we need to get you login credentials, and then there's a training that goes along with that. It's a pretty simple system to use. It allows you to upload receipts, and it just kind of streamlines the process.
I use Concur in my regular job. It is very easy to use as far as expense management goes. But the quick question I had is the thing that's in this binder mentioned something about a card. I don't know that I have am I supposed to have a card that I'm using?
So you may not have it yet. So all board members are going to get a travel and expense card through the college. And so if you use that, so I think they've probably been approved, but you probably just don't have it yet. So when you make airline reservations, when you pay for a hotel, when you do all that, if you use that college card, that automatically feeds into the travel management system. And so it's easier, and then you don't have to use your own card. You just have to be careful of what you're paying for with which card. Right. So if you accidentally charge something on your college card, which would not be the first time that's happened, then you just disclose that, and then we figure out how you pay the college back. All right, if there's no other questions about that, I'm going to end this section, and I think the chancellor's next. Oh, you're welcome. Like I said, I know we're throwing a lot of stuff at you today, so anything you think of now or later, just make a note, and then we'll figure out how to do some follow-up. Do you want me to stay for this, or do you want me to go?
It's up to you.
At your disposal.
Nothing you haven't already heard before.
No specific travel questions. There's an opportunity this afternoon.
So this afternoon, we're really going to be talking more in depth about the travel opportunities. If you have specific questions about scheduling or booking things or how to pay for things, then what I would say is after this afternoon, let's get you an individual appointment, and then you can arrange whatever it is that you need to arrange. Or if we need just a more general orientation, we can do that too. Yeah, so at the end of the study session.
I'm speaking specifically about the conferences we may go to and what the college thinks our responsibilities are when we attend those things.
Yeah, so that's on the agenda for this afternoon at the last segment of the study session. We're going to have a calendar that lists what those big conferences are, and then we thought we would we would speak with the board, and you would speak amongst yourselves to decide, well, which ones make sense, what are the priorities, who should go, all those sort of things, and then we'll figure out the logistics.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm talking about the one this evening. So the 4 to 6, the last segment of that is like 20 or 30 minutes just about travel, and so that's we will put up a schedule. If you have questions about what those events are, we'll figure that out, and then you can figure out amongst yourselves how do you want to kind of divvy those up. Now you have to hold the button the whole time.
Is it always on?
It's really not very convenient
Okay.
to do that all the time.
I'll just do it from here.
Something else
That's
at
a
the same
long time to hold the button for. I'm just going to do it from here because I don't want to hold on to the button for.
Better decision than I made.
Need a break at all? Just had it. Okay, perfect. All right. Good morning. So what I thought I'd do this morning is really talk about the vision and direction of the college and what it's rooted in. So you have a sense of, kind of why we're going in the direction we're going in. So I'll talk about the master planning work that went on. Then I'll share a little bit about some of my own community engagement work that I have been doing at the local, state, and national level. So, but a lot of time will be spent on this first part of it. And please ask questions as we're going along. So when I first arrived here in Pima, I talked about the need for community colleges especially to close 5 gaps. And then, so I'll talk about each one of these and how they really became the focus for the work at the college. Not specific goals and objectives as much as here are focus areas and why these are focus areas. So the educational achievement gap, you all know that as a country and as a community, we struggle with our students coming in college ready, and it disproportionately impacts students of color. So that's why educational achievement is a big focus of what we are doing. And then as the work progressed here at the college, we initiated a redesign effort around developmental education. And that's one of the areas that we received a Bellwether Award for the work that we've done. So we've done great work, and I'll be glad to share more about that later if you'd like. So another big area, no surprise, global and diversity. So back in 2005, 2006, the Senate, U.S. Senate, commissioned an Abraham Lincoln Study Abroad report. And one of the conclusions coming out of that report, no surprise, Americans know less about the world than the world knows about America. And it is to our detriment that that's the case. Well, it's not gotten any better since then. So what happened in that report is, at that time, probably less than a quarter of Americans actually held a passport. And then when Americans would go travel abroad, guess where they would go travel abroad to? Primarily Europe or other Western nations. Again, to the detriment of the United States. Of course, some rule changes, so that number is up higher now, because to go to Mexico, you have to have a passport. To go to Canada, you have to have a passport. But that hasn't really changed the reality that Americans aren't really going to these other countries where we know less about, that are critical to our national security, to our economic security. So that's why a big focus on global is, so what's the next best thing that we can do as a college? Well, bring the world here and create powerful learning opportunities for engagement with students from across the globe. Because most of our students cannot afford to go to these other countries. However, we have done some things. We have really upped our study abroad programming here. We've sent students to Ireland, to China, and they come back and they think of the world differently, having had those experiences. So that's why that focus on global. It's for me, yes, it brings in revenue, but it's not about the revenue as much as about the learning and the engagement opportunities for our folks here in Tucson. And then the diversity piece, I think, speaks for itself, that we have to be ever vigilant and make sure that all of our students not only have access, but more importantly, complete and go on to better opportunities in the community, especially opportunities that allow for a livable, sustainable wage, as well as being a more well-rounded individual for the broader society. So that's kind of the global. The technology gap, again, no surprise there. This is transforming every aspect of our lives. But back then, that was back when a lot of colleges weren't really moving into the online space. A lot of folks resisted the online space. Many folks thought, well, this is just a passing fad. And, well, I think we all know the answer to that now. It's not a passing fad. It has been a transformative area of what we do in higher education. And the likes, Coursera has really just outpaced everybody. Going through the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, they have really transformed the landscape around the use of online education. Now, I'm not saying it's perfect because there's issues with it, but just know that that was the initial focus around technology. So when I got here, I worked with faculty to create a task force that ultimately led to the creation of Pima Online. And thank goodness we did that, because that positioned us nicely going into the pandemic. But technology is more than just online, just so you know. So now we're focused on what we call the 4 superpowers. That's an article, it's based on an article written by Pat Gelsinger. If you don't know who he is, he was the former CEO of VMware. He's now the CEO of Intel. So he talks about the enabling technologies of AI, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, mobile, and the Internet of Things are really what's underlying all of that technological transformation you're seeing in our community and across the globe. And obviously, the most recent manifestation of this is ChatGPT. And so we're going to have to grapple with the realities of ChatGPT into the learning environment. Now, I've played around with it. I don't know if any of you have played around with ChatGPT. And I've asked it questions, and, it's pretty good, but it has not answered my questions fully, and in some cases has gotten it wrong. Go ahead, Teresa.
Chancellor, I don't know what GPT
it's
is.
Open AI, so artificial intelligence. So it's, what's the best way to describe this? So it's using, the technology tools to help you scan and search the entire global database around any topical area you want to put in to it. It will write your papers for you. It is now writing papers for people, because you can just ask it, write me a paper on topic X, and it'll write a paper for you, drawing from all that data that's out there, and creates an incredible document for learners. It has, people have played around with it. It has passed law exams. It has passed medical exams. It has passed other exams. I mean, that's how powerful of technology this is. Some colleges are fighting against it. Some colleges are looking at how do we embrace this and integrate it into the learning process, because what's happening is students are using it to write their papers, to do their homework. And so I don't think we're going to be able to control that side of the equation. So how do we bring it into the learning environment and help students use it responsibly? It's an enhanced version of using Google. Think of it that way. It's an enhanced version of using Google, because it will do work for you, like write your paper, like answer your questions on exams, et cetera. Yes.
I was in the middle of the debate over whether or not the state was going to allow students to use calculators on a state assessment.
Right.
And it evolved to, it went from a significant issue, highly divided, to why are we worrying about that?
Right.
Do you see that coming?
Yes,
With the AI?
absolutely. Because it can be perceived as a threat, and the threat being people are legitimately worried that these technologies are going to replace the human piece of the equation. So I think that's a legitimate worry, especially on part of faculty and staff in certain areas. But I'm of the mind is let's figure out how we make sure we're a relevant part of the equation and that we don't get displaced because we've shown how we add value on top of the technology as opposed to just letting the technology take over.
I don't think I'd ever be worried about faculty or you know, the teachers getting replaced. I think my worry as a former educator is that this is going to replace students. If students aren't doing their own learning and thinking, at some point they might realize that they're not where they need to be.
Right. Well, but it goes hand in glove, because if students aren't where they need to be, then they're not going to show up, and then you won't need faculty because you won't have any students to teach. So I want us to keep that in mind. I think we're in a position to show how you leverage the power of these tools to enhance learning, enhance productivity, and not be afraid of it. That's really more what I want to illustrate here. Just like the calculator, right? The calculator didn't end up replacing anybody. It just enhanced that learning experience. It enhances the work experience. Yes, sir.
No, I was just saying, I think that's the right approach. I mean, we grapple with AI in healthcare a lot in my regular job, but I mean, I've talked to physicians that have said, you know, I don't know exactly which AI they're using. There's a lot of them out there on the healthcare side, but we'll say, I have a patient presenting with these symptoms. What's the most likely diagnosis? And the AI will come back with something that they hadn't even thought of, because they're prioritizing one thing over another or whatever. There was one I was seeing that the doctor thought the person was maybe having a heart attack, and the AI said, no, they strained a muscle in their ribs, and it turns out, yeah, they strained a muscle in their ribs. They weren't having a heart attack. So it can be powerful when you can integrate it, where it could help that physician make a decision, but it wouldn't necessarily replace that physician in that scenario. So yeah, it makes sense.
I think the other thing, when you especially think about AI, you know, it's that data analytics piece. So how do we make sure we're integrating more data analytics into what we do? Because data is going to become ever increasing in its significance, but how do you make sense of it? How to use it for good as opposed to some of the things that we're seeing happening in some pockets. So just keep that in mind. So technology is a big focus, and it's going to transform every facet of what we do. And you know, thank you, Teresa and Greg, for coming out to the Ford Asset ribbon cutting. And as you know, today's modern vehicle in some cases have over 100 million lines of code that power the vehicle. So what does that mean for someone who's working on today's modern technology of a vehicle? But it goes beyond that. And by the way, a car has more lines of code in it than a fighter jet does. And sometimes people don't realize that. And then the other thing that's going to happen is just the explosion of semiconductor, the chips in the car, but the chips are going to be everywhere. You can actually put chips in paint and paint your walls with these little microchips in them, and they give you all kinds of data points about your indoor living conditions. And so that's why the whole issue around semiconductors is a big deal as we go forward. And obviously our state's becoming a center for semiconductor technology. Let me go to sustainability and then come back to skills. So sustainability there's two parts to that. One is the whole green component, and then the other is just the organization itself. So let me just highlight why I think those are critical pieces. So I don't know if you ever read Jared Diamond's Collapse, but if you haven't, I highly recommend it, because he was really signaling what we're starting to really see happen more and more today. People were signaling that even before he came out with his book, but it's real, whether we agree with it or not. You know, the warming of the planet, access to vital resources is something that we got to be mindful about. And so how do we educate and train our learners for that. But also at the same time, as an organization ourselves, how do we make sure that we're being responsible stewards for the use of our facilities and the like? So that's one of the reasons underlying this notion of turning the whole college into a living learning laboratory. I mean, we have this wonderful ability to use the data that comes out of the building for our students to learn on. Why not leverage that? And that's what we're doing. That's partly part of the partnership with Train is about, is turning the whole college into a living lab. But we're using, going back to technology, the digital twinning technology to create a virtual replica of the college. And so the students aren't using the data that's happening in real time. They're using it in a lag way, but by using that digital twinning piece. So it's lagging a little bit, so they can't interfere with our physical operation, but they can learn a lot from our physical operation, especially in the space of energy management systems and the like. And then you're going to see more programming around sustainability, whether it's in the curriculum, as well as in some of our training programs. So we have set a goal to reduce the carbon footprint of the college by 50% come 2030. And the modernization of our facilities and reducing energy usage, about 25 to 30% of that will happen just from the Train partnership. That shows you how much energy is wasted from how we operate our facilities. Then the other side of sustainability, and this is no surprise, states have been cutting their support for public higher education for a long time now. So when I first got here, I said to the board, don't be surprised if the state of Arizona zero outs our state aid, because I could see the trend line of what was happening, especially as we were coming out of the Great Recession. A lot of states were struggling, but no state struggled as much as Arizona. And then when you looked at the data from that time, the state of Arizona had cut higher education the most in the country. And then by the time you fast forward to 2018, our state had cut higher education well over 50%. No other state cut higher education by that amount. No other state. So what are you going to do? And for us, that translates into, at the time I got here, we were still getting about $7.5 million. But at the height of our state investment at this college, we were at about $23 million. So imagine every year having $23 million more for our operations that we no longer have. And so that's what we were faced with. And then we have other issues in this state, the expenditure limit, because what else is happening, not just here, but across the country, is the birth dearth. And the birth dearth is low fertility rates have translated into what people are calling the SANSdemic. SANSdemic meaning fewer people to do the work that is needed to sustain our current economy at its current levels. And so we're projecting in our county, probably in the next 10 years, about a 17% decline in the high school population. So enrollment-wise, we cannot make our enrollments by focusing on just K-12. It's just not going to get there. So how do we keep our enrollments at a reasonable, healthy level? Well, we've got to go to all these other groups that are much more difficult to reach, and they have different expectations in terms of they want more convenience, they want access on their terms, they don't want necessarily a full degree, they want shorter term. So you're seeing us evolving into that reality as we speak. The skills gap, I mean, we there's probably not a week that goes by that you don't hear about the skills gap. And there's different facets to that, right? In some cases, it's not always about the people, it's about whether the people have the actual knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the work, and that work is being heavily influenced by the technology today. And so how do we make sure that we're closing that gap for our community? And so when you take all of these together. I put them in that centerpiece there, which I like to refer to as the liminal space. That liminal space being that transition point from an industrial era curve onto the digital curve. So if we can close all 5 of those gaps, that will firmly move us from a 20th century based higher education model onto a more digital era, forward-thinking, learning institution. And so that's where we're headed. And by the way, this concept of the 2 curves is based on a book written by Ian Morrison called The Second Curve. He wrote this book just before the turn of the 20th century, and he was basically telegraphing to all of us and across really the globe that this transition was underway. And Ian Morrison, just so you know, if you're not familiar with that name, he's the former president of the Institute for the Future. And you may know that name, Greg, because I know he does a lot of consulting work in the healthcare space. And his focus a lot about that space, but it really applies to all of us. So that's what we're doing. So how does that manifest itself? I made some references to it earlier, and that is, the focus on the institution or the organization is going to decline. The focus and emphasis will be on the individual learner, and they will dictate the terms of their experience, not the organization. So how do we keep pace with that reality? So you're already seeing this happen where students are getting credits from a lot of different institutions as we speak. How can they stitch that all together into a certificate, into a degree, or depending on what they're doing, being able to sit for a licensure? And so that's an example of that transition. So the degree and the certificate, although they won't go away, they won't become the only outcomes from a learning institution. So we're going to have to make ourselves more and more relevant to what that learner wants. And so I liken it to, I sometimes use the analogy of the Apple playlist. And that is, we can create our own playlist on our phones or tablet devices and just choose whatever songs we want and put it on there. Well, that's what students are going to do in terms of their learning. They're going to stitch together the courses they want, and then they're going to go shopping with institutions who are willing to give them that degree for having done that. So where is this really happening a lot? You're probably familiar with Western Governors University. So at Western Governors University, competency-based model, in 1 year, for the price of probably less than $7,000, I can do a full bachelor's degree in 1 year doing this model. So this direct assessment you talk about, Wade, this is what's going on. And by the way, our governor, if you heard this, he signed just before he was going out an agreement to bring WGU into the state of Arizona. Even if they weren't here, they were already here. So you're starting to see this evolution with University of Southern New Hampshire, another big player in this online space and this competency base. ASU has become ginormous in the online space, and if you heard recently, ASU signed an agreement with YouTube. So it's already happening. So how do we remain relevant to today's learner and the future learners? And it can't be the way it used to be. That's why I think if we focus on those 5 gaps, we will position ourselves nicely going forward. Any questions? So I know not everybody's going to agree with what I'm saying, but step back and look at what's going on. And if you read The Great Upheaval is really just chronicling all the things that have been going on in terms of the evolution. But what harm is there if I'm wrong? Think of it that way. What harm is there if I'm wrong? But if I'm right, what's the harm? Well, there won't be Pima. That's the risk. And so just keep that in mind. You want to say something?
I just wanted to mention, I am excited about all of the, things that are happening to education. But once again, from my perspective of being a math teacher, I did look up, a community member sent us an email recently about WGU and said, you know, why isn't Pima College doing something like this? And I looked into it took quite a while because you had to get past their firewall and you had to sign up, you know, for whatever. But I think it was $7,000 per semester, and you could take as many units as you wanted. But I'm thinking about someone who wanted to get a degree in math. And if you wanted to get a degree in math and you paid $7,000, there's a good chance that you could maybe learn well 2 classes. So in that aspect, Pima's tuition is way cheaper than WGU. And so I want to be careful that, you know, we don't put, you know, it is great, it is exciting, but it might not be the fix for every single occupational and educational path.
Right. No, absolutely, right? It's not going to work for everything. But it's also recognizing that today's learner wants it faster, cheaper, and still expects high quality. And that there are providers providing those options to today's learners. Whether we agree with those as the best options or not doesn't matter. That's where the puck's moving. And so keeping that in mind, and how do we position ourselves? I think the community colleges are in a unique position because a lot of the stuff is taking place online. There's some things at some point you can't just do online. At some point, you got to put a needle in someone's arm, right? At some point, you got to get under the hood of a car. At some point, you got to climb aboard the airplane and go through the body of that plane. So there's a lot of pieces that just can't be done in that modality. But how do we help people understand that so that they realize they've got to come back to a physical place? And underlying all that, math underlies all of that, right, as an example. And so how do we make sure everything's integrated in a way that they see the value here at Pima and realize they have to come at some point? So how do we, and I think what we saw coming through the pandemic and as we're coming out is a lot of our faculty have really gotten to the point of saying, okay, this can be done in the virtual space, but this part can't be done in the virtual space, and how they integrate those two. So we've seen a lot of that evolution happening here.
I think this is a real healthy conversation. One of the things that bothers me is when we talk global, national, and Pima County, the message that's being sent to our young people and even our middle-aged people is you can make a considerable amount of money in this community without learning anything.
Right.
Yesterday, we're going to the basketball game at the U of A, and we had in-laws from out of state, and we want to go to breakfast. Well, if you're in a hurry, you can't go to breakfast in Tucson because you have to wait in line. And the servers that I've interacted with are very intelligent, and they're mostly young people because I think the old people are sitting home with their feet up. But how does the community dictate what is employable? And how do we compensate the long term for our students to go to school,
Right.
and go into a profession that they can live longer and healthier,
Right.
as opposed to carrying big dishes with plates and
Right.
trimming trees and chainsaws and all this kind of stuff, because you can survive in Tucson with that kind of income, but you can live very nicely if you
Right.
get a good education with skill sets that are employable with employers that pay more money.
Right.
And I think that's a dilemma that we're facing right now is what's the incentive and what do we do to show these students to entice them to work harder at a higher level, get a math degree, become an engineer.
Right.
And I don't think K-12 is doing a very good job of that. And so good conversation, but where do we go with this?
Right. So that's where your Pima is going. So that's what the Centers of Excellence are in part about, is what you just raised. So that our vision, our master planning work is centered in those focus areas that I just identified. So we went out and contracted with a firm. It was 2 firms where we did a GISing of, geographic information systems analysis of our entire service district to look at where are the opportunities to those good paying jobs, those family sustaining wage jobs in this community. And how can we realign the assets of Pima to better create the pathways that lead to what you're describing. And so that kind of underlied the work of the facilities, the educational and facilities master plan. The other thing that we did was unique was we integrated the 2. A lot of places will run these parallel planning tracks, but we integrated the 2 to say, okay, you only need facilities to do this over here. Facilities are not their own stuff. So why are you doing them in isolation of what it is that you should be focused on? So that's why we brought them together. So coming out of that were the centers of excellence. And so those centers of excellence are aligned to the job opportunities here that lead to the family sustainable wages. And there's some exceptions. I'll touch on that here, going back to your point. But how do we know we got it right? We pressure tested it by holding forums and brought in folks from the community and asked, did we get this right? And they absolutely, overwhelmingly said, you got it right. So that's where the Center of Excellence for Applied Technology comes from. And it has 3 verticals in it. There's the transportation vertical, there's the manufacturing vertical, and then there's the construction technology vertical and the applied technology. So that's why the investment at the airport to expand, because we knew that there was demand for being an A&P technician. Airframe and power plant is what A&P stands for. And those are really good family sustaining paying wages in this community, but also across the country. And that's because we were able to show the data. We had the business community validate what we were doing. That's why the state was willing to invest in that expansion of that effort. And we worked with JTAD. JTAD was essential to that work, along with the other high schools in the area and the business community. But that's an example. But then we have another center of excellence in hospitality, culinary, and tourism. Well, those don't necessarily start out at a family sustaining wage unless you can persist through that into management levels where you can get to a better pay piece, but it puts you on a pathway that we can build off of. And then healthcare is another center of excellence that we have. We're doing the big renovation work at West Campus to double the size of our ability to train and educate in the healthcare space. And then you have IT, cybersecurity is another area, public safety. All of the ones I just mentioned, minus, all lead to those family sustaining wages in this community. But there are also realities around that. You got to have an applied STEM foundation to really get into those career tracks. And so that's why we created an IBEST model, Integrated Basic Education Skills Training, that contextualizes the learning of those developmental skills into that program of study. So we're starting to see success in that. We're doing more co-requisites as well. And so, again, those are some of the positive things. But that's aligned to the opportunities here in this community. Our challenge is getting those folks to want to come here. And so Brookings did an analysis of all 50 states, and they looked at the metro areas. They created these MSAs that are already out there and looked at, so how many jobs do you have that are low wage jobs? So in Tucson, when you isolate to Tucson, about 49% of our adult working age population are in low income jobs, 49%. When you break that down, about 12% of those folks who work in those low-income jobs already have a bachelor's degree. About 8% already have an associate's degree. And then when you combine those two categories with the some college category, that number jumps up to about 56%. So even with what we do, it's not leading to family-sustaining wages for some members of our community. But what we found launching the micro pathways is we're recapturing some of those students who probably would not have come back. And then we're getting them on the micro pathways are an on-ramp into the larger programs. Some of those folks may want to go on. Some of those folks may want to just go directly. That may help them with the current work that they're in. But it's going to be an ongoing challenge. There's no question about that. But we cannot, the demands in the healthcare space alone, Pima alone can't meet the need. There's just no way. We just don't have the capacity. But those are some of the best paying jobs in this community. We could probably turn the whole West Campus into just a healthcare piece, and maybe we'd get closer. But the cost to do that would be beyond what we'd be able to afford. So keep that in mind. The other thing that we're doing, it wasn't in the master planning work, but we got work underway now. We're looking at applied baccalaureate degrees. Given the rules that are at play in the state of Arizona and the Higher Learning Commission, we're only going to be able to launch 2 at this stage. And so we're in the process of vetting which 2. And the way the legislature created that law was it could only be in this applied area. And it had to be that there were jobs. So we can't go out and offer a bachelor's in liberal arts, as an example. So my challenge to the team is, I don't want to do what everybody else is doing. Let's figure out where there is opportunity that leads to good jobs here where you need a bachelor's degree. And these will be the 2. Now, Maricopa has an advantage over all of us because each of their colleges are independently accredited. Because of that, they can do 20. So you've seen Maricopa launch a number of bachelor's degrees. Well, it's because they can do 20. And plus, they've been working on this long before that law got passed. Now, I will say this. Now, we're going to have to go out and promote this in the community before we launch it, because when I first got hired here, I was told that one of the issues they had with the prior administration was they were trying to turn this into a 4-year institution. And so when you start to offer baccalaureate degrees, that's what you're starting to become, is a 4-year institution. So I think we're going to have to go out and do some educating in the community before we launch, just to make sure we understand those resistance points and why. But this is not like it was back then. Okay, and I think that's an important part of the education piece. This is not like what it was back then, but we're moving down this track. And then a lot of other things you've seen us do, you can trace back to that master plan work. Not all of it, but a lot of it. So they talked a lot about career pathways, guided pathways. So that's the work that you've seen us doing, and especially in the transfer space, because a lot of the career technical ed programs were pathways, but the transfer side was less so. And so, and then there was a focus on teaching and learning centers, refugee and immigration centers, and you're seeing that all coming out of this work that we've done. Any questions about that? Now, I've been trying to get us to position for the future. I'm talking 10, 15, 20 years from now. We don't know what this community is going to look like that far out, but can we leave Pima in a place where when things do evolve, it can evolve with it? Yes, we're in that moment where population seems to be dropping off, but that's not going to be forever. Then it's, I think, going to climb back up. Well, once that starts to happen, is Pima ready to step in and into that void and do something about it? But if we're only thinking about right now, we're gonna box in future leaders of this institution if we're not thinking ahead that way. And so one area I'll signal now is you're starting to see this in California especially, the whole housing cost piece. They can't afford, their employees can't afford to live in the community in which they're working. Their students can't even afford to live in the, so some of those colleges are looking at building housing for their employees. Well, Flagstaff is already there. Flagstaff is already struggling to try to attract and keep people because the cost of living up there is just such that it's become a challenge based on what they can afford to pay, right? I think we need to think about that. So making sure we have the available real estate for a future expansion in that way becomes important. And I'll let you know, West Campus, that property does not belong to Pima Community College in the sense that we get to control how we use that property. That is Bureau of Land Management land, so we can't just go and do what we want on that property. We've got to get clearance through the BLM, and it's intended to be used for educational purposes. So if we wanted to modify the use, we'd have to have serious conversations. I mean, there's a lot of real estate out there, as you know, and over the years I've had developers coming wanting to do things out there, and I said, no, we can't. Sorry, we have this restriction on us. Downtown campus is ideally situated, but it's in a small footprint. So that's why we've been expanding the footprint of downtown campus to allow us to position this college for the future should we need to do that. We've been in discussions with NAU to have them potentially co-locate onto our downtown campus, and we would build a facility together. And so as a result of that, that's one of the reasons why we purchased, I always get the name of the, St. Elizabeth's. You know where St. Elizabeth's, right there on Stone. I'm sorry, not Stone, but Speedway, and just down from Stone. So we purchased that property there. Right now, they're still in there, but I think they're going to vacate soon, and then we're probably just going to level it for now, and then look at where this NAU conversation goes, and that could be a potential home for that facility. We've been working with Pima County One Stop to create an integrated one-stop center on, in this case, it would be on our downtown campus. Well, we got to have a place to put that. So what we're looking at, thanks to those hotel properties that we've acquired, we have some square footage that we can work with. So that may be the place that we site our Pima One Stop, at least in the temporary period until we figure out a better solution. So what is a one-stop, right? It's bringing all these different services that people go to in different parts of the community, housing services, job placement services, and put them all in one place. And that's happening in other parts of the county, by the way. But what's missing is it's not on a college campus where folks today need to go and get that skill. So they'll go there and then they'll leave. But if they go there and they're on a college campus and make it easier. So the earmark we just received with the county, that was $2-point-something million, was to help give us some seed money to do this. So we're very, fortunate that we were able to get an earmark, and we got earmarks for other additional funds. And the first year that they brought back earmarks, we also got funds there. So the last 2 years, we've been successful in that effort to generate revenue to help support some of this. Any questions?
Yeah, this is maybe a very specific zoning question, so I don't fault you if you don't know. But obviously limited land. The next thing that pops in my head is up.
Yes.
So like how high? I assume there's some zoning regulation about like building heights or floor amounts that could go there. Do you happen to know what those limits are?
So I have Jeff here, and so if I say it wrong, he can chime in. But because we are a state-owned entity, we're not subject to the same local zoning restrictions that others are restricted to. So let me just say that first, right? But there's a reality, right? We live in this community. So if we wanted to build a 10-story facility at downtown campus, who's that going to upset, right? So we need to be mindful about that. Certainly going 3 stories, 4 stories, I mean, that's our manufacturing center is a 3-story facility. We haven't gotten big outcry about that. But I think if we wanted to go higher, we're going to have and we do. We already, when we do those projects, we talk with the community. But there probably is going to be some limiter, not from a legal standpoint or zoning standpoint, but from a community standpoint. And we, going back to St. Elizabeth property with NAU, we're also, Catholic U, they recognize that they can't just function out of Washington, D.C. So they've been looking at locating in other parts of the country, and that was part of the original mission of Catholic U, was they wouldn't just be in one place. So they came to Tucson as the first place they wanted to start their expansion efforts. And so we worked with the mayor's office and with I forget the name of the, off the top of my head, but an outfit out of Washington, D.C. to figure out what would make a lot of sense in terms of how we partner with Catholic U. So we're now partnering with Catholic U. We offer a business degree. And so it's a 2+2 model, 2 years with us, and then they transition over to Catholic U, but they start out as a Catholic U student. And it's going well. I mean, it started out a little slow because of the pandemic, but it's going well, and I think where it's going to evolve to is Catholic U is going to want more of a presence in Tucson. So we're hoping that St. Elizabeth property could also be about university partnership expansion. And so we can accommodate, because I'd rather them come and partner with us instead of going across the street, building their own thing, and now we're in competition versus, hey, we're working together and we're sending a strong message because of co-location, and let's provide more baccalaureate opportunities for Tucsonans and give them options besides just U of A and besides NAU, and in some cases ASU. And so Catholic U is here, so we're very excited about that. And they brought down the cost of their degree significantly by partnering with us. So I think you can get your 4-year degree on average is $10,000 a year. When you couple our part into it, because ours is really affordable, right? But when you average it out, it becomes pretty reasonable for them. Anything else? That's kind of high level around the master planning work here and the vision of the institution. There's other elements that I've left out, but I want you to know that there was a strategy behind all of this, that we just didn't just come up with these ideas and start doing them, but there's a lot of intentionality to it, and it was very data informed. And then we worked with our employees because we wouldn't be able to do any of this if the faculty aren't buying into it, if the staff aren't buying into it. And you saw it firsthand when you're at the Ford piece. That's because they're all engaged with that. Now, we still got work to do to get more folks engaged. So what we're doing now, I'll say this one last piece about the Centers of Excellence. We're in conversations to create a Center of Excellence in the sciences. And we're going to have a summit. This is where we go out and start to pressure test with the community. And sometime, I think March or ish, we'd love for you all to come and be part of that if you want to be part of that. We just listen. We share what we're doing and then we listen. And so we're looking at having the Science Center of Excellence be housed at the Northwest Campus. And then another thing we're looking at, and I'm going to be having conversation, is creating a Center of Excellence around the humanities. So when you factor in the education piece that we already have, you factor in, we have the Vote Center, Voices on the Economy piece. If you look at what we're doing with the ethnic, gender, transborder studies, and then we start to integrate more of the behavioral health pieces. All of that runs out of our humanities part of the college. Can we create a Center of Excellence centered in the humanities? And again, this is aligning to the needs of the community, and then the community being part of helping to shape and form what that looks like. And then we have a Center of Excellence for the arts. We're looking to build that out. That was part of the original work that we were doing. And so we've not evolved that much at this moment, but we're looking to do that. And now, the other thing that happens sometimes in these centers is we go out on benchmarking tours. We go and look at who's doing this well across the country, so that we understand our goal isn't just to do it, it's to do it knowing that we want to be best in class. So what does best in class look like? And then how can we bring that thinking into what we're doing? Anything else on this?
Is there, I mean, you said the arts was part of the original
Right.
group, so is there like a timeline you're operating under? And the only reason I think about it is, I don't remember when I read this article, so forgive me, but I feel like there was some, for lack of a better word, controversy recently, because I think the U of A ended its musical theater program, and there were some groups that were kind of decrying that, you know, it was so important. But anyway, it just made me think when you said the Center around Arts.
So some of the timeline is built based on the resources that we have. So like, for example, when we centered on applied technology, we knew we could bring the money in to be able to do that project, so we put that on a timeline. And so that's already close to being fully realized in that way, because that involved a lot of capital investment to do that. Another one that we were looking to launch was our public safety piece, moving it from the 29th Street Center to East Campus, but where we're running into challenges on the resource side. So we can't fully optimize the potential there without being able to generate revenue. So we went and asked the governor last year for a $20 million investment. Well, we didn't get it. So we're looking at making another run at that by asking Governor Hobbs if she would invest into this. We'll see where that goes, because it is construction dollars, and we were trying to get it out of the ARPA money. And former administration thought you couldn't use ARPA money for construction projects. We've researched it. That's not the case. You can use it for construction projects. You just got to use it within a specified time frame. And so a lot of it's dictated by, you know, what are the opportunities in this community? Do we have the resources? Do we have the engagement level we need from the faculty and staff to create the project? And then we create the project plan. So we were in process on the arts side to start to build towards a project plan, and then our dean, his wife got a great offer on the East Coast. He left us and joined her on the East Coast. So we've had to take a step back. We now have a interim dean in that role. So we're going to have to come back and revisit that. We have lots of the facilities already, so it may not be so much about a place as much as does the curriculum, is it modernized and enhanced enough? Do we have the right partnerships in the community to strengthen all of that? And is there enough interest in terms of student demand for those areas? So we'll be doing that work. Anything else on this particular topic? So in order to pull a lot of this off involves, you know, being engaged with the community. And when I say community, I'm talking at every level, the local level, the state level, and the national level. So I'm on a number of boards, a number of committees at each level. So I thought I'd just share with you just a few examples of that. So here in our community, I'm on the Southern Arizona Leadership Council. I'm on the board of directors for that group. I'm also on the Sun Corridor Board of Directors. That's the economic development organization for our community. And I'm actually on the executive committee of Sun Corridor. I'm on the Tucson Airport Authority Board. And then I'm on the United Way board. I'm the past chair of the United Way. And so those are just some examples of some of the work that I've been doing locally. And then a lot of our employees obviously are on different things as well locally. I'm on the Banner Advisory Committee here, and then we have some of our executive leadership on the different boards of the hospital, local hospital boards as well. I'm on the Arizona Chamber Board. I'm on the Arizona Commerce Authority Board. So that's the statewide organization that is focused on economic development. So for us to have a seat on that board is very major for our community, because you don't get a lot of Southern Arizona folks who get a chance to be on. It's usually dominated by Phoenix folks. Downside is I'm probably going to become approaching my term, but I have the relationship, so that's the nice piece about that. And then let me see what else I'll highlight. So we were involved in the Reskilling and Recovery Network. I don't know if you were familiar with that. So the Western Governors Association partnered with the American Association of Community Colleges and created this initiative to really help our communities as we went through the pandemic. So we formed a piece here in the state of Arizona, and then we submitted our proposal. Our proposal was accepted. So Pima took the leadership role in creating the Reskilling and Recovery Plan for the state of Arizona. And that's huge that Pima took that lead. And then locally, I was asked by Sun Corridor to lead a similar effort here in our community, so we created a recovery plan for us here locally. So again, it's just an example of the impact we're having at the state and local level, but it ties back to the national stuff. So I'm involved with the apprenticeship work through the American Association of Community Colleges. I'm on the President's Advisory Committee to the President of ACCT. I don't know when he's going to term me out, but I've been on there for a number of years, so I could end up getting termed out. I'm also on the Community College Workforce Consortium. I'm on their executive committee. I'm involved with the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities. I'm directly on the membership committee for that. I'm also on the membership committee for the Higher Learning Commission. And recently I was asked to sit on the Credential Engines Board. And what Credential Engines is about is bringing greater transparency to credentialing, because there's already over 1 million unique credentials in the marketplace in the United States. Over 1 million unique credentials. So what is a credential, right? So Lumina defined. Lumina is one of the big foundations that supports colleges and universities. So that's who Lumina is. So they define a credential as a degree or a certificate, a licensure. So those are things that make, but there's no quality control over this. It's just a bunch of organizations creating their own credentials. And so Credential Engine is trying to take all of that and create a better, more transparent system so that learners, as well as folks who would employ folks who get these, can make better sense of what this actually means. And so I'm on that board. So Barbara Gelman-Danley from the Higher Learning Commission is on that board. Ted Mitchell from the American Council on Education is on that board. The Chief Strategy Officer for the Society of Human Resource Managers is on that board. Microsoft. So I think you get the idea, right? So Pima has been able to position itself in some very unique, high-level parts of this country. And that's why you're starting to see the kinds of success, because we've really gotten Pima's name out there, and we're being asked to participate in a lot of transformative work tied back to what we were just talking about. So those are just some highlights of my personal engagement with things. I hope this board would want to see me continue to do that, because I think that has a lot to do with why you're seeing the things happening here at the college. Any questions? And lunchtime, right? Thank you.
Thank you. Do I call for a recess again?
So we're going to call for another recess.
You got it?